what if I told you that you could understand the psychology behind why people buy and apply that to your podcast and your business? You'd probably be, Anna, tell me more. So today's guest is Melina Palmer. She's the CEO of the Brainy Business, and she also has a podcast, the Brainy Business Podcast. Melina has been podcasting for, by now, over 5 years with over 270 episodes. I gotta say that she has mastered podcasting to a level that I am just very impressed with. Melina teaches applied behavioral economics through the Texas A&M Behavior Lab, and she also has a master's in behavioral economics from the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. She also has an understanding of marketing because she worked in the past in the marketing industry, and that gave her amazing insight into how you can craft your message to get people to buy. And I think that it's so important on your podcast because it is proven that listeners who hear about brands in podcasts are 7 times more likely to buy the products and services advertised on those podcasts. So if you're out of business, you have to hear what Melina has to say because it's going to completely change the perspective of what a listener is. We talk about success and how she was able to leverage her podcast to pretty much achieve anything amazing that came her way for the past 5 years. So I think it's inspirational, super practical as well. And I can't wait to share more with you. This is the podcast space. I'm your host, Anna Xavier, and join us for a conversation that's going to give you practical insights to improve your podcast journey. The lawnmower just started. It's like magic. Here we go. Hi, good. Melina.
Yeah.
Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I'm so excited to have you. And before I even delve into anything else, I have to say the reason why we're sitting here together. Beyond the fact that you're a genius, you're a content creator who's super inspiring.
Thank you.
Yeah, obviously. I have to say that we're sitting here today because my husband falls on the category of a super fan. And a super fan for podcast listeners is like if you're a podcaster, that's the person you want in your tribe. This is the person who loves what you do. They are hardcore listeners. Every single episode you put out, they listen. They are the people who will get you new listeners, like I mentioned on episode 4. These are the people who will get you potential listeners to turn into like actual consistent listeners. And they just love your brand so much that they will tell others, you have to listen to these podcasts. I will force you to sit down with me and listen to these podcasts together. They have a podcast for you at all times. They're like, oh, wait. There's these podcasts that you need to listen to. And guess what? Is yes from Melina. Yes, it is. And that's my husband.
Well, I love that.
Yes.
Yeah.
He literally will turn me into a Melina fan. Like, I love your content as well because it's so practical and like it really has actually helped me with a ton of my marketing, understand user behavior and how people buy. So thank you for that, Melina.
Of course, yeah. And thank Diego, of course, for me, as I know we've already done. But yeah.
Right, exactly. But the reason why you're sitting today is I just think that people, podcasters particularly, don't take enough time to think about how people behave and how people buy. And if you're a podcaster, you're likely a business owner who is trying to gain trust with your listeners to get people to buy from you. So, Melina, you've been podcasting for many years now, and you have 2 books. You write prolifically. You have just so much content out there. But I'd love to know, like, what are the things that when you're thinking about creating content, like where do you think people make a huge mistake when they consider like user behavior and that they have to stop doing?
Sure. So I would think that the first thing and the first piece of advice that I give to people is to get out of the user behavior to consider here is your own as the creator of things, and knowing that our brains are really wired. So for everyone who doesn't have that knowledge of me, I don't know how much you're going to do in the intro, but I'm an applied behavioral economist. I specialize in the behavior of people, and I consult either for my podcast or through my work with helping people to understand how we can get employees to buy in and customers to buy. Like that's really where I focus, and understanding what the brain really does. So with this, for ourselves and how we act, we're always kind of looking for that quick, easy solution. And because we're a herding species, we are looking to what has seemingly has worked for other people so we can get to the next place fastest, right? So we are constantly looking on Instagram, or we're seeing what's on TikTok, or the podcasts that have millions of downloads all the time. And we see these and think, oh my gosh, I want to be just like that. And this is how they got there, so that's what I have to do today. I always have loved the, not to compare your blooper reel to everyone else's highlights reel of what you see on social media and things like that, right? So to think that you just go from 0 to 1 million immediately, and that you have to be everywhere all of the time. And anything you see that says, create a podcast in 10 minutes a day and have a bazillion followers. No. Like, don't pick any path that you don't want to pour all of yourself into, so podcasts aren't for everyone. I think they're great. Clearly, my entire business has been built on the Brainy Business podcast, and it's done amazing things for me. And that is because when I decided to do it, I committed to do once a week for at least 6 months to see how it was going to work for me before I could evaluate it, and putting everything I could into that. That was the most important thing for my entire company for 6 months, and then would go back and evaluate. And, in my case, it proved itself much sooner than that. So it was a pretty easy adjustment. But if you think you're going to just be sprinkling everywhere and see what's working and then evaluate, it's never going to work very well for you.
So when you're talking about how soon it got you results, how soon was that actually?
So I started my podcast. By the time this comes out, it will have been 5 years. And yay. But they say the average podcast after 30 days of an episode being live has, I think, 114 downloads per episode, maybe 141 or somewhere around there, right? Probably less than your reach on LinkedIn or any of your other social channels that you already have. So that's something to keep in mind. And know that those averages are counting in the gajillion of downloads podcast too, right? So, that's something to keep in mind. And so I think in getting over the average was within the first month. Definitely for those being above average on podcast downloads. And in my case, it was really because I had found a blue ocean without necessarily knowing it going in, that it was a space no one else was talking about applied behavioral economics into business anywhere. And so and I was right at the tip of when that was going to be blowing up, and not in a way that you necessarily knew was going to happen, but I had a hunch, and here we are, right? So it's important to know that if you are looking to what everyone else is doing and trying to be one more voice in a crowded space, it's a lot harder to get that sort of traction. And I've traditionally not done a lot of monetizing of the podcast. I have space for ads and things now, but for the first several years, really everything has been about the relationships that are formed that turn into consulting, to the teaching that I do now, to courses, to speaking engagements, and leading to books and all of those things. And a lot of that, came on within those first 6 months, that those relationships started very early.
Yeah, and for those who are just kind of starting the podcast journey, there's many ways you can define success. It can be to create content that, for instance, I don't necessarily like writing a lot. And so to me, creating a podcast content is a way to connect deeper with people. Also do some thought leadership. You can say build networking relationships that can either get you to that kind of clout / thought leader status, or really get opportunities that you wouldn't be able to because you're kind of sitting, quote unquote, in the same room as someone else who is, well connected, generate sales, and just kind of improving your footprint. And so for you, initially, it was just, how can I get my message out there? And by the way, I have to say, Melina, I feel like I know a bit more about your journey, so I kind of have to hang on, I need to reframe this a little bit for those who don't know you. But I think that also most people forget. And I think that, like, as someone who has worked in the podcast industry or in the podcast space for a while now, for over 10 years, I have to say that podcasts are still perceived as a high value medium. People can write, but not that many people can do audio podcasts because it just has another layer of complexity on it. And we're filming this right now, so like even doing video podcasts is like another thing. People still perceive podcasts and content like this on kind of like audio form and video form as something that is like almost like having your own radio show or being kind of equivalent to a media personality. So did you feel that taking that leap and taking the courageous step of being like, you know what, I'm going to do these podcasts, like, was it something that you were like, there's something about doing a show instead of just writing papers or articles?
So when I decided to do that, so I have a background in acting and all the things, singing and whatnot. So I'm pretty comfortable on a stage, for one. And I've done a lot public speaking really my whole life. And so it was a pretty natural transition to be able to be doing the podcast. Though I will say it was super weird where when you go from doing speaking engagements, and a lot of those early episodes are kind of things that you're used to talking about to an audience or whatnot, and you know how they react. And it was very weird to have these moments. And the first like 80 episodes of my show are all solo episodes. I never intended to do interviews, though I do a lot of them now. So you got to be flexible and kind of go with things as time goes on. But when I first started doing those, and it's, 10 o'clock at night and I'm recording something, and you have those like pause for effect moments where it's like, I know someone will laugh here. You tell a joke and then sort of wait, and you never know if anybody's on the other side. We've all kind of gotten into that, maybe from Zoom these days if you're doing your presentation to the crickets of the world. But, so that was a little bit weird. But I was part of a mastermind, like a one-day thing with a really successful podcaster, and that a friend had introduced me to. And so I was saying, and I remember very explicitly, it said, I see the empire at the end of the road, 5-10 years down the way. I see where I'm going, and there are 85 paths to get there. And I'm sure by the end, I'm going to be doing most of all of those 85 things. And I'm just not sure which one is the right one to start with. Not really sure where I go from here. And my background, before getting my master's in behavioral economics, is in marketing and brand strategy. And so I figured I was just going to be doing some like layering in behavioral economics into the marketing work I was doing. But at that mastermind session, she had said to me, she said, I never tell anyone to start with a podcast because they're always more work than you think, and stuff we've already said here. And you need to go do this yesterday. Like, go do it immediately. Go do this right now. And I said, okay. So then I'm like, Google, like, how to podcast, right? Kind of figure it out. But I had that almost permission from someone that was there saying this was the right step for me to take in that moment, and just didn't even take the time to pause and see if I should look at something else. And like I said, decided to go all in on it, which I've always been pretty good at when I find the thing that I want to do, that I can just, head down and make that happen. So that piece for me was something that I was able to just charge forward with, I guess, and really lead that way.
So when you were looking around, you're like, at the time, 5 years ago, I mean, I'm thinking about 5 years ago, and yeah, like a lot of people were just getting into podcasting, but it wasn't necessarily like, it was like, oh, okay, this is something you could do, but only like the big thought leaders were already in it. And there's something about the early adopters and how there's like a strong value put forth in people who are early adopters of platforms like video podcasting, video live streaming, all of these things. And did you feel that initially people are like, oh, what you have a podcast, Melina?
Yeah, you still get that, and people go, whoa, and you want to say like, okay, like you can record in your phone and post it and you're a podcaster, right? Like you could have a show pretty easily. It's not like you have to get a sponsor first or you have to do any of these things to make it happen, which I think is really cool, right? You can go say what it is you want and have that opportunity to have a voice in a way that resonates with people really well. And you can find your tribe if you're going to be clear in what your message is about. So the initial reason I started the show and what I thought it was going to do, which it definitely did, but the goal for me, like you were talking about finding what success means for you. In my case, it was being that top of the funnel. And so in a space where, you know, people today, a lot of people don't know what behavioral economics is yet. And 5 years ago, way less people knew what behavioral economics was. And so to try to be cold calling potential leads and saying, hey, there's this thing. It's called behavioral economics. You should really care about it. It's super important for your marketing. Oh, and by the way, you should hire a consultant and that should be me. Right. Like that is a super, super hard sell, like uphill all the way, really difficult. And so the reason I created it was to help those people that would have an interest in this psychology of buying decisions and understanding behavior, that they would be able to find it. And if they like me and the way I talk about it, then it really just warms up a bunch of leads. And that is definitely what it has done. And it's because I created it for that purpose. You know, that was the intent of it. And so, like you said, knowing what success means to you, whether you're looking to write a book, whether you're looking to do a podcast, whether you want to be all over LinkedIn or do TikTok or YouTube or all the things, right? Picking what that channel is that matters for you, always being the question of to what end, right? You're doing this why, and then what's next for people. So great, 1 million people are listening to your podcast. And then what, right?
Right. What does it mean to have
Right.
1 million? Is it a vanity metric, or is it actually going to further you down your path to growing your business, or whatever it is, or applying to be a speaker? I feel like a lot of people use that, like, oh, rated at top 5 on like business people. Charts change daily and sometimes hourly. Like that means
Right.
literally nothing.
Right. But, you know, as the, you know, herding and social proof, it is good to be able to showcase some of those things. But I do think it's funny where sometimes I get pitched a lot, as I'm sure you can appreciate for all sorts of things. But, you know, it was like, will you be a guest? I think this was to be a guest on someone's show. And it was like, we're rated, it's like the #1 podcast for, and it was something like, aspiring entrepreneurs who are interested in showcasing their best selves in their life of where they're going to transition from. And you're like, you're the #1 because it's like the most specific random thing.
There's like you and someone else, or like in Iceland or something, and you're like, yeah, like I'm sure the charts there are like
we're the #1 podcast for people named Melina who are interested in this, who were born in the month of May, that want the what, you know, like so random. So anyway, in a lot of that it doesn't matter. And I always advise to people is to look at setting your anchors better. So this is using a behavioral concept from the work that I do. So in the case of anchoring, we're very swayed by numbers. They have a lot of influence on us in the way that, you know, if you say that you can, like, soup's on sale, limit 12, people buy more than if you say that there's no limit, which is a weird thing, but, you know, numbers influence our behavior a lot. So when you are setting your anchor, and I was saying before, you're looking at people's highlight reels and those that have hundreds of thousands of downloads in an episode, or that have millions of followers on social media and looking to be that thing. If you can only be successful if you reach that like 0.001% of the top, if you're like, I'll only be good if I am like the Justin Bieber that got discovered first on YouTube before anyone else, that's not a great business model or a plan. I always say to reset our anchor and say, okay, if I hit the 140 downloads, if I'm at the average, will I be happy? Will this be a successful venture for me? And like, sure, there could be others down the line, but if I only have 100 people listening every week, what does that look like? And what's the value in this thing? It's the same with, books never sell as much as you think they do. Podcasts don't do as much as you think they will. But especially if you're spread too thin, and especially if you don't know why you're doing it.
Yes. And you were talking about earlier on, how the knowing what your kind of metrics are. But at the same time, I want to remind people, sometimes the type of work you do is so specific. Mm-hmm. It's so niche that you will never, like talking about the charts and stuff, like you will never reach specific charts because the people who actually align with what you sell and what you're talking about are such a small percentage that like by itself, you will never get there anyway, because it just does not mix, like right. It's not the same thing.
But yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but like you said too, on the numbers, so, and often because people are more likely to talk to you when you have a podcast, there have been people that I have been able to have access to that are like charge tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars for their consulting, for their time, for speaking engagements. And they've come onto my show to be a guest. And then we've continued, relationships since then. And so access to people where you're giving them a platform and a value where they're able to go speak to people, like those connections may be the top of the reason why you're having any of these conversations. Like your ideal client, you can call them up and say, hey, do you want to be featured on this podcast? They're much more likely to say yes than, hey, can I pitch you some stuff, right? And once you're a known entity, someone that they like and they trust and they understand and they appreciate, we've got reciprocity in here too. You gave something to them, so they want to give back to you. There's a lot of value in all of that. And it shouldn't always be about what's in it for me when you're going out into the world. I always recommend that anything you are giving is genuinely, like, if it doesn't result in them buying from you, you still should feel good about having done it. But knowing that a lot of the time giving first will return many times over.
Yeah, and we will get in a second into things that actually worked out because of your podcast, because I think that not enough people think about the podcast as an actual tool to make your personal goals a reality. And I've gotten work. I've been hired to do work after being a guest on someone's podcast because they're like, oh my God, I kind of knew from social media and stuff that you knew stuff. But right now, listening to you for these past 45 minutes or doing a pre-call, I understand the value they bring so much more now. Let's do business together. And I'm not even talking about the listener. I'm talking about like the guest in front of you. That sometimes is the best way to monetize your podcast, unintentionally, if you're being a guest. But yeah, like tell us a little bit about like things that actually happened because of your podcast and some personal goals that have happened, like maybe meeting your personal heroes and stuff like that. Because I want people to be inspired to try different things and not just go, you have to be top whatever.
Yeah. So no question, 100%, every single thing that I have done in my business these past 5 years, I can tie back to the podcast 100%. Like, no question about it. It's been super, super valuable. That includes the teaching I do at Texas A&M. So they found the podcast, and this is a little bit of in that giving first, I would do shout outs, especially early on, for 5-star ratings and reviews and say, thanks so much. And, there was one that didn't know where they were from and said, hey, if you want to let me know, can follow up. He was a program manager at the Human Behavior Lab there, blah, 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 right? And then they invited me to come down to the lab, and I got to go see what they were doing in the space of human behavior studies. And we ended up creating a certificate program in applied behavioral economics, and I get to teach and have students from all over the world that I've been able to teach through that program, which is super cool and wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. And many of my students have then gone on and we've had projects together. I've done work with Walmart. I've done work with Mars, with Kind, with Maker's Mark, many others, many of which I can't talk about. But you know how that works. So that's the cool thing, right? Like the cool clients that I can't say their names. I have a bunch of those too. one of the guests on the show, he's much cooler than I am, and he introduced me to the publisher, and I ended up getting a deal for my first, second, and now it's not announced yet, but book 3's in the works. So knowing that there's always something with that, definitely people whose work I really respect and that is amazing. Like anybody that's not in the psychology space, if I say, oh my gosh, I've had Robert Cialdini on my show and he did an endorsement for my second book. Like if you're not in the space, you can say, okay, cool. And people that are like, oh, amazing. Like that's the coolest thing ever.
Oh, I love that. You were like, oh my God, is this reality pinch me?
I know. That's where like definitely some of the people I've been able to connect with whose work I just absolutely love and get to talk to is just super, super, super cool. And that they've, become friends, I would say, in a lot of ways, some of whom are like texting friends, and then there's other layers to that, right? But yeah, definitely work. I got to go speak in Amsterdam for doing some live podcasting at an event. I've been like just all the things. I feel like checking all the boxes. Not the TED Talk yet, but like that's next.
It's in the works
on the to-do list. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I love that. And by the time this interview is aired, I have definitely revealed already this one thing that I think that is huge that I don't think enough people think about. But when I'm editing, I do edit my podcast at this stage, and I have these moments when I'm editing and I stop for whatever reason. Maybe I pause because I need to go and grab a glass of water, and I look at myself or realize that I'm smiling. I have the biggest smile. Or I'm laughing as I'm editing the podcast. And it's just, people don't have an understanding of how much a podcast can change you personally. Not just your work or whatever. Like you will be, because it's kind of almost like an act of self-care, because you're meeting your heroes or you're talking about something that you love. And at the end of the day, it's also about like how these podcasts is making you a better human. And if you really love the content, I mean, if you're doing a podcast for the wrong reasons, you're like, psh, and like that ain't me. And I'm like, well, definitely we have to change that. But when you love what you do, you become magnetic, and I feel like that's what happens to you, right? Like you're like so passionate about every single topic that you're approaching. Your goal is to educate, and I feel like in the beginning stages, you sometimes go through that phase of like you're educating your potential business lead, or you're educating them about that need they have, and then they become interested. Or sometimes it's just like them understanding the depth of your content. So do you feel like after editing, like after these episodes, do you feel like either like your endorphin levels or your like dopamine levels, you're like, who am I? Like I'm in this state.
Yeah, it's really cool. I really love everyone I get to talk to. It's so fun, and asking questions that other people haven't had a chance to ask. And all the books I've been able to read like 6 months before they come out. Like, ooh, how cool is that, right? And I'm getting, pitch emails from Harvard Business Review Press, Simon and Schuster, HarperCollins, Penguin. Like their people are now pitching me to see if I'm willing to read books to feature guests on the show, which is like, how cool is that? Like, I don't even have to pitch anybody because there's just enough there, and you get, I guess, known for being a fun and interesting interview. That's one tip too. I mean, be good to your guests. One of the things that I would say is the best advice that I've gotten is something that came from my husband, and early on, and where he was saying, just no matter how big you get, don't big time people.
I like that.
Right? And for anyone that didn't immediately resonate with what that means, I remember being at an event once, and it's one where I know they weren't, and not to say this is bad, I've done, especially early on, you do a lot of free speaking engagements, and that's cool, right? Like I give a lot of time away, especially early as you're figuring stuff out. Obviously the podcast is a ton of time I invest in things. And I'm all about helping people. But this was an event that wasn't something that was like this person was being paid $1 gajillion to be there or something. And I remember her saying, where it was trying to like you're selling to the people in the audience at this particular event. And she said, you can try to get a meeting, but I know I'm really busy, and you'd have to be Jesus to get more than 15 minutes on my calendar. It's like, well, no thanks, right? When you're putting all this work on other people because you're so busy and important, like nobody likes that. And making it easy for people and make it so they want to work with you. Like, one, there's so much stress that comes with trying to prove how important you are all the time. And it's really refreshing, I think, for people when you're just a normal, kind human person, but it feels good anyway to be doing that. But, just make it easy for people, be kind and be generous. And, even if you are busy, that's great. And you don't have to make them feel bad about it. It's, something about them. And so, just knowing that it's really cool to be able to do these things and being generous and kind and thoughtful. Be the Betty White, right? Let's channel Betty White.
Yes. And now I'm thinking, like, when I promote these podcasts, I'm going to make sure that I include Betty White somewhere there.
Love it.
Yes. Maybe I'll Photoshop our faces into the other Golden Girls.
Ooh, fun. I'm jealous of the skills that you have that I clearly do not. Photoshop is one of those things that I do not have the skill for.
Well, you do have other skills. Like, I'm kind of like thinking, I want to peek in your brain. And like, I'm sure you're like, well, I guess Photoshop skills are nice, but but out of that, what you said, I actually got recognized in these podcast conference that I went to twice.
Cool. Isn't that fun?
Oh my God. I was like so excited, especially there were actually people in the industry. They weren't just podcasters. And again, at the time I didn't have a podcast, but I had, I've been for the past 3 years creating content online on video and stuff, so people recognize my face quite frequently. But people will be so surprised if you are super down to earth and nice. It will like double the aura effect of your personality. They're just like so much more excited because they're like, oh my God, either one, you sound just like on your podcast, or two, you're like so attainable. And I think that is a selling point. But you were telling me earlier about like the things that like kind of like repel people. And I want to hear, what are things that you do on your podcast that kind of lead people into doing business with you or doing the things that you want them to do? Because sometimes it's not just about like buying anything, it's just doing specific things. So what are things that we can do and incorporate on our podcast?
Yeah. So I will say one, just to add into what you were saying there, one of the other things that I always do, so I always encourage people to come find me on social media. And I, never say never, but while there are options to be automating or having a VA that's handling social channels, I always, that's a really big piece of being able to connect with people and for them to know that it's really me. And I do get people all the time where, someone will share something on Instagram or they'll tag me in something in LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever. And I always try to respond, to retweet or whatever, and to say thank you for those sorts of things. And I have people so often that will like then, say like, oh my gosh, I didn't think that you would actually answer me. Like, how cool, right? So like, well, yeah, like you took the time to tag me. How cool is that, right? Like that people want to follow up and ask you a question. So knowing that in that same like not big timing people piece, making it so it's really easy to connect with you. I say my actual email address out in the world. And for here now, it's melina@thebrainybusiness.com, right? Send me an email. I'm always happy to talk with people. And I always encourage people to come find me on whatever channel they prefer and to come start a conversation, to connect, whatever. And so that's one thing. And then it really is me. And I take the time to respond to LinkedIn messages and Instagram DMs and all the things. And knowing that sometimes it takes a little bit longer than I might like, but I always get there, right? We make it happen. So that's one thing. I also do a redonkulous amount of freebies. I give away so many freebies and worksheets and things, and know that that is a strategic choice that I made for my business because I knew that, like some point I might want to have something like a a calendar with the like bias of the day or biases of the week or something to be doing. 5 years ago saying this might be something I'll do someday. And the idea of sitting down and saying like, okay, like page 1 worksheet and trying to make 365 or even 52 worksheets sounds horrible and like something I don't want to do at all. And so if I force myself to do them one at a time early on, and then I'm editing worksheets when it's time to compile them into something, makes it a lot easier. But having those continual freebies that people are able to go and access is something that is encouraging them to go to my website, to get on the list, to be in the family, in the community, right? I also make it really easy with pretty links. So, and I reference the episode numbers a lot, which not everybody does. I heard you saying, that was an episode 4, right? And people are always amazed. Yes. I'll say like, hey, you should check out episode 99. It's on bike shedding. It's a really good one. Or like loss aversions number 9. I'm up to 270 plus episodes now. And so we get a little bit murky in there.
Do you have an Excel spreadsheet that is like your savior?
Oh, for sure. I actually keep it in a Coda doc. But in general, there are a lot of things that I know just off the top of my head because I'm constantly referencing them. And when I'm presenting and speaking, it'll just say, episode 16, or it'll say, whatever for that, where if you want to go learn more about framing, you go check that one out. I don't have to reference it. I don't have to be way over the top about it.
Right.
But I'm really putting in that extra effort to help make it easy for people to find more information. And again, because my podcast is an educational one and I'm teaching people about concepts that they might not be able to find elsewhere and they're looking for those resources, that investment really makes sense for my show. It's not necessarily what everyone needs to do in every single situation. And one thing that I'm really proud of is, again, with 270 episodes, I'm now doing 2 a week, and the Tuesday episodes are refreshes of stuff from the back catalog. And then there's a brand new episode every Friday, which is what we've done since the beginning. But in 5 years, I have never had an episode not get at least 1 download every single month. Every single episode has had at least 1 download. Usually it's closer to a dozen or so every month with that evergreen content that people are finding, and it's still relevant and useful for them. And where I'm referencing, like, there's power in the numbers of those back catalogs, even if you're not having huge numbers per episode. When you start to get more and more, if someone subscribes, they're not just 1 download, they're 50, they're 100, they're 1,000, right? As you get more and more. And so to know that investing in really solid content that's going to be useful for people down the road and referencing other content to keep them in the system and other ways to connect with you, I think that's all really important. And being super open, and don't be super salesy, but you can't mention enough that you do work. Even when I'm doing a keynote or something and I say, when I'm working with clients, I this and that, people will come up after and they go, oh, like, do you work with clients? Like, did you hear when I said, yeah, like, so people hear a very small percentage of all of what we say. And so know that even when you feel like you've said it a lot, you probably still haven't said it enough.
Yeah, I have to stop you because I have to make references to what you said because hang on, this is so good. Just because of what you just said. So for our listeners, hello, listener, this is you now paying attention. So a couple of things that I love that you said is like you actually talk about the client work you do. And I cannot tell and stress enough how important it is that you do work, because there's the people who think, oh, do you do work? And there's people that say, oh, she doesn't do work. So why bother? It's not for me, or it's not with me that she will want to work with. So giving clear examples of the work you've developed gives social proof, but also puts the listener in the perspective of like, oh, I also have that issue. I want Anna's help. Actually, just this month that we're recording this now, but I got someone who emailed me as like, hey, I know that you're Portuguese, but I have a podcast in Spanish. Do you do podcast power hours in Spanish or other languages? Like, yes, I do. So I ended up getting a sale just out of like, talking about how I'm Portuguese, all these things. But at the same time, I'm like, oh, hang on, I need to go on my website and make sure that like somewhere there I say, hey, I work with these languages. And that is super important. And again, when people launch an episode, they kind of like launch it and forget it. And I'm like, you're saving money. Like if you're thinking about like how you can monetize the podcast, you will monetize your time by not having to speak about something and just saying, hey, episode whatever, go and listen, right?
Yeah. It also helps, like you were saying, with that thought leadership piece. So for me as a professional speaker, which is a big chunk of the work that I do and how my business makes money, that being able, when people say, well, can you talk about this? You say, oh yeah, I have an hour-long episode on that. Like the safety that people feel in knowing that you know what you're talking about is really helpful and valuable to say, hey, I've got legit hundreds of hours of me talking about all of this stuff, and know that I can work things in together to be able to address what you're talking about, or, that the value is really there. And it helps you to establish your own thoughts on something, right? As you sit down. That's why I'm really against the like set it and forget it, like 1 minute to 800 podcasts or whatever people are preaching these days. Side note, I saw something, I've been seeing an ad on my Instagram recently where someone's like, how I set up 5,197 passive income streams with no effort. And I'm like, 5,000 income streams you think is no effort? What? Like that makes no sense.
I know.
Like managing all of those and even knowing they exist would be so stressful.
Yes.
Like why do 5,000 things bad when you could do like 2 things well? It's so bizarre. But again, this is how our brains are kind of wired. So I get why. But, so if you can sit down and think again, why am I doing this? To what end? Past podcast episodes have become courses that I sell. And the way I think about something has become the foundation for my books. I write books way faster than most people do. And a lot of it is because I have all these years of podcasting and my thoughts on topics. And then they've turned into speaking engagements. And those worksheets I talk about, I can use as workbooks that I can give to a conference or for a client if they need it. Or when I turn things into a course, or my teaching at Texas A&M, or all the things, right? Like because I sat and thought about what that framework might even look like. How would I present this? Like then that turns into the post for Inc. So I write for Inc. magazine. You also which is another thing that I think comes out of the work I've done with the podcast, and being able to be, a featured speaker in something here, or to turn it into a book. Any of that stuff. When you are thoughtful about creating it the first time, it becomes that much easier to then repurpose it, which is the whole point of some of this content. And even I don't do anywhere near enough from the content I have already created. That's a big goal I have always, to be leveraging it better into, short videos and things that I know are going to be really relevant for people. But you can reuse that content, and taking the time to be thoughtful and shape your opinion can then be so helpful in working with clients.
Yeah, I love what you said, especially because these 2 things, and I'm going to be very brief. I'm going to try to be brief, but a lot of people say, oh, I've done a podcast episode about it, I can't charge for it. Or they get super shady and they go, well, I'm going to share like 20% of what I actually know. And then you end up like, not as a listener, you think, does this person actually know what they're talking about? So the more you reveal, listener, the more your own listeners will think, oh, okay, like they are the person for me. They know in depth. They're not the 5 hacks, 3 tips, and set it and forget it kind of person. Like you're building a trusting relationship. So it's worth to create content that actually is useful.
Yeah. And, you want to be thoughtful about the, giving away the milk for free sort of deal. But finding there are lots of people that still want you to do it for them.
Yes. I love everything you said. It's like, yes. I'm going to look into these podcasts. I'm like, how many pieces of content can I make out of just your quotes, Melina? Because there's a lot. All right, so I feel like we have to close this show because otherwise we're just gonna keep talking. It's not bad, but I mean, I want everyone's attention to be really focused on what we said, and we'll, I guess, have to set a time to talk another time about more things. But if our listener wants to know a bit more about what you're doing, and if actually you have anything for podcasters specifically, let us know where we can find it.
Yeah, so the best place to find me is thebrainybusiness.com. That's where you can find links to the books. You can find the podcast and consulting and speaking, all the things. You can also find me on all the socials as the Brainy Biz, B-I-Z, except on LinkedIn where I am Melina Palmer, and the Brainy Business is there too. And I already gave my email, but happy to do it again. It's melina@thebrainybusiness.com. And like I said, it really is me. I'm here and happy to chat and always like to connect with people. So if you even have that little bit of a thought of maybe, would she want to hear from me? Yes, I would. I would love to hear from you.
Oh, yay. Well, Melina, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. I really appreciate it. And I think that there's just so much in what you said that is useful for our community today, tomorrow, 5 years from now, because I think your content is timeless. And that's the last tip that I'll leave our listeners with. Don't create content that you can't really reuse in a year time. So, well, listener, hey. You know where to find me. It's thepodcastbase.com/podcast, but anywhere at the podcast space, THE podcast space, and Instagram, you know, because you've been here for a while. I keep saying that Instagram is the place where we have fun. A lot of creative stuff happens there. So let me know what your insight was from this episode, what you're going to try. And I got to just say that keep creating content that is imperfect, but moves you forward.